Keanu Reeves had just finished his speech at a charity event, his deep voice carrying a calm yet powerful message about mental health awareness. The crowd cheered, moved by his words. Keanu was used to the adoration, but today something felt different. It wasn't the typical red carpet or movie premiere vibe. It was more real, more grounded. The charity event was all about raising awareness, and Keanu had shown up to support. No entourage, no glitz, just him, his old leather jacket, and the one thing that never seemed to leave his head, his hat, a simple black beanie, slouchy and low-key. But to the people watching, it was more than just a piece of clothing. For some reason, it had become his signature, his look, if you will, and that's when it happened. A group of bikers, clad in leather jackets and filled with swagger, rolled into the event. Their motorcycles revved, the sound like thunder cutting through the peaceful atmosphere. They weren't just any bikers. They were notorious for their high-octane stunts and a rebellious streak that had earned them a fierce reputation around town. But today, they were here for something else. Max, the leader of the group, was the first to step forward. His eyes narrowed as he looked Keanu up and down, locking his gaze with the actors for a few tense seconds. He let out a low chuckle, the kind that made you feel uncomfortable. "Yo, Keanu!" Max shouted over the noise of the engines, his voice filled with mockery. "I gotta ask, man, what's up with the hat? You trying to make a fashion statement? Or what?" Keanu blinked, caught off guard by the sudden attention. He smiled, trying to brush it off. "Just keeping it simple," he said, his calm voice a stark contrast to the rowdy biker group surrounding him. But Max wasn't done. He stepped closer, pulling off his helmet and tossing it aside, his grin widening. "Simple, huh? Looks more like you're hiding something, like a celebrity trying to blend in. We all know the real Keanu's hiding behind that hat of yours. Let me guess, you're too scared to show your true self, aren't you?" The crowd fell silent, tension building in the air. Keanu could feel his pulse quicken, but he didn't back down. He was used to being under the spotlight, but this felt different. Max wasn't just talking about his hat. This was about something deeper, about challenging his persona. "Listen," Max continued, his voice growing louder, "I say we make this interesting. How about a race? You, me, and my crew. If you can outride us, you keep the hat. If you lose, well, we get to decide what happens next." He flashed a toothy grin, like a predator sensing an easy meal. Keanu wasn't sure where this was headed, but something inside him clicked. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the pressure mounting. This wasn't just about a hat anymore, it was a challenge, one that would put him to the test in ways he hadn't expected. He glanced at the bikers, then at the crowd. They were all waiting for him to say something, anything. Keanu let out a quiet laugh, the sound barely audible over the hum of the motorcycles. "You want a race?" he asked, his voice steady. "Fine, let's race." The crowd erupted into cheers and murmurs of excitement. But Keanu wasn't sure whether the adrenaline surging through his veins was from the challenge or the realization that this was no longer just a stunt. This was personal. Before Max could reply, someone from the crowd yelled out, "Keanu, you!" "Can't let them get away with that. Show 'em who's boss." The cheers grew louder, and Keanu felt the weight of their expectations. For the first time in a long while, the spotlight felt different. He wasn't just an actor anymore. He was about to prove something. Max raised an eyebrow. "So it's on, huh?" he said, a grin still playing on his lips. "Get ready to lose that hat, Keanu. We'll see who's really the man around here." The bikers revved their engines. In unison, their machines growling in anticipation. Keanu stood still for a moment, breathing in the tension, letting the cool air settle around him. He had no idea how he was going to pull this off, but there was no turning back now. With a nod, Keanu said, "Let's do this." As the crowd parted to make way for the race, Keanu felt a shift in the air. A surge of energy, a spark of something that hadn't been there before. This race wasn't just about winning. It was about standing his ground, about showing the world that he wasn't just some celebrity. He was human, just like everyone else. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Keanu couldn't help but wonder as he prepared for the ride of his life. The sun was setting as Keanu revved his bike, its engine rumbling beneath him. The roar of the crowd mixed with the low hum of motorcycles created a symphony of tension that seemed to vibrate through the pavement. Max stood at the starting line, his arms crossed, his grin widening with every passing second. The other bikers were gathered around, some adjusting their helmets, others eyeing Keanu with barely hidden amusement. Keanu, on the other hand, was silent. His heart was racing, not just from the adrenaline but from the sudden pressure of the situation. This wasn't a typical stunt. This wasn't a movie set. This was real. Max looked over at Keanu, sizing him up. "All right, here's the deal," he called out, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "We race from here to the old warehouse on 8th Street. It's a straight shot, but don't think it'll be easy. If you win, you get to keep the hat. If you lose—" Max paused, letting the words hang in the air like a thick fog. "We get to decide what happens next." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by decide?" he asked, the question hanging between them like a challenge. Max leaned in closer, his breath heavy with the scent of motor oil and sweat. "Let's just say we have some ideas. I'm sure we could come up with something fun, maybe you'll lose that hat and have to take a nice long walk home. Or maybe something a little more creative." Keanu could feel the heat of the crowd's eyes on him, and for a moment his thoughts flickered to the fans who had come to see him today. People who looked up to him, who admired his calm, his kindness, and the way he carried himself. Could he back down now? Would they think less of him? But then something else flickered in his mind. This wasn't just about a hat. This wasn't even about proving himself to Max or the bikers. It was about standing up for something he believed in, being true to himself and not letting anyone push him around no matter how big the challenge. Keanu gripped the handlebars of his bike, steadying himself as the tension in the air grew thick. The bikers around him were waiting for him to say something, to make his move. "All right," he finally said, breaking the silence. "I'm in, but if I win, you leave me and my hat alone. No funny business." Max smirked, clearly pleased with Keanu's response. "Deal," he said, his eyes narrowing with the thrill of the challenge. He turned to his crew, giving them a quick nod, and the bikers began lining up, revving their engines in anticipation. Keanu felt his nerves start to settle as the gravity of the moment hit him. The street was lined with people, some cheering, others placing bets, all eager to see the famous Keanu Reeves take on a group of rowdy bikers. Keanu's reputation for being calm and collected, almost zen-like, was known everywhere. But here, in this moment, he wasn't just Keanu the actor. He was Keanu the man on a mission, and there was something deep inside him urging him to go for it. Max lined up at the front of the group, giving Keanu one last look. "Better hold on tight, Reeves," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're going to need more than just a hat to beat us." Keanu couldn't help but smile a little. He wasn't going to let Max get to him. He wasn't going to let anyone get to him. The race was about to begin. A signal went up and suddenly the engines roared to life. The countdown started and Keanu felt his heart race. 3, 2, 1. The bikes shot forward and Keanu was right, behind them. The wind whipped against his face as the street blurred past him, the sound of engines filling his ears. His muscles tensed as he shifted gears, trying to keep up with the other bikers. They weren't playing around. Max was already pulling ahead, weaving through the streets with ease. Keanu kept his eyes fixed on the road, focusing on the task at hand. He wasn't just racing for the hat, he was racing for his own self-respect. Every turn felt sharper, every curve in the road more dangerous than the last. The crowd's cheers grew louder as they passed familiar landmarks, streetlights, abandoned shops, the occasional stray dog darting out of the way. Keanu's focus sharpened. He wasn't going to let Max get too far ahead. But then something unexpected happened. As Keanu neared the first big turn, one of the bikers, a younger guy with a scruffy beard, swerved dangerously in front of him. Keanu slammed on the brakes just in time, his heart pounding in his chest. The biker smirked over his shoulder, clearly trying to throw Keanu off. Keanu's grip tightened around the handlebars. He had expected this kind of trickery. Biker gangs weren't known for playing fair. Max's voice rang out through the chaos. "You think you can handle this, Reeves? Keep up or get out of the way." Keanu was no stranger to tough situations, but this was something else. The tension in the air was almost palpable as the bikers used every dirty trick in the book to throw him off balance. And all the while, Max's taunts echoed in his mind, pushing him forward. But something inside Keanu told him not to give up. He could feel the momentum shifting. His focus had never been sharper. He was determined to prove them wrong, to show them that he wasn't just a famous actor. He was a force to be reckoned with. The race was far from over. But Keanu knew one thing for sure. He wasn't backing down. The crowd's roar grew louder as Keanu pushed forward, the finish line still far in the distance. The night had fallen fully now, casting long shadows across the road. The streetlights flickered to life, illuminating the asphalt in patches of yellow as the motorcycles raced on. Keanu's breath came in quick bursts, his fingers gripping the handles of the bike as if his life depended on it. His pulse pounded in his ears, but it wasn't just the race that was getting to him, it was everything. The crowd, the stakes, the challenges from Max and his crew, all swirling together into a storm he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The sound of the engines around him roared like a symphony of chaos, but Keanu pushed it all to the back of his mind. He couldn't let the noise distract him. Not now. He was focused solely on the road ahead, the twists and turns of the city streets becoming more intense with every passing second. He needed to stay ahead, or at least keep up with Max, who had managed to maintain a slight lead. Keanu could see him, his silhouette cutting through the dark with ease, the lights of his bike glowing like a beacon. Max had been right about one thing. The bikers were ruthless. Each turn of the race was met with more tricks, more tactics to throw him off balance. A biker in front of him would veer suddenly, forcing Keanu to swerve, or another would push just a bit too close, making him fight for space on the narrow streets. They weren't just racing, they were trying to break him, but Keanu didn't back down. With every jolt, every sharp turn, he tightened his grip on the bike, reminding himself of what was at stake. The hat, sure, but more than that, it was about proving he wasn't the joke they seemed to think he was. He wasn't some actor playing a part. He was Keanu Reeves, and he would ride through this race like he had faced every challenge in his life, with determination and a steady hand. The wind tore at his face, his hair whipping in all directions as he tore down the streets. The race had taken them out of the city and into the industrial outskirts, where the roads were rougher, less predictable. There was less light here, and the darkness seemed to swallow up the bikes as they cut through the empty streets. Keanu glanced to his side, his eyes catching the flashing neon sign of a dilapidated warehouse on the horizon. 8th Street. It was. So close now, just one more turn, and the finish line would be in sight. But just as Keanu prepared himself for the final stretch, the unexpected happened. A sharp pain shot up his leg as he attempted to push his bike to the next gear. He grimaced, feeling the cramp that had started in his calf muscle spreading quickly. He tried to shake it off, but it wasn't working. The more he pushed, the worse the pain became. His body was screaming at him to slow down, but Max was still ahead, and Keanu couldn't afford to lose now. Come on, Keanu muttered. To himself, gritting his teeth. His leg burned, but he forced himself to keep going. Each second felt like an eternity, the ache in his leg dragging him back. But his willpower refused to let him stop. He refused to give Max the satisfaction of seeing him fall behind. The bikers behind him were getting closer. Keanu could hear the roaring engines as they inched up behind him, their riders closing the gap with every acceleration. His heart hammered in his chest as he tried to maintain control, pushing his body through the pain. The finish line was near, but so was the growing threat that his body might just give out before he reached it. Suddenly, Keanu heard a shout. He looked to his left and saw Sarah, the former biker who had been helping him train. She was standing on the sidewalk, her arms raised in a gesture of encouragement. Her eyes locked with his, and the silent message was clear. "You've got this. Don't stop now." Her presence was a lifeline, and it was enough to fuel him forward. Keanu pushed the bike harder, the pain in his leg intensifying, but he refused to let it dictate his movements. His thoughts started to clear. He couldn't focus on the pain. He couldn't focus on the pressure. He had to focus on the finish line. Max was only a few feet ahead now. The last stretch was in sight. Keanu's leg was on fire, but he wasn't about to let this slip away. He could hear the crowd in the distance, their voices a dull roar in the background. But it was the sound of the bikes that mattered now. His focus narrowed to Max, the one person he had to pass. Max glanced back, catching sight of Keanu's determination. A smug grin spread across his face. "You can't keep up, Reeves. You're not built for this." But Keanu's eyes were fixed on the road. The pain in his leg, the mocking words from Max, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the finish line. The lights of the warehouse were now shining brightly in front of him, signaling the final stretch. The other bikers were closing in, but Keanu had one last burst of energy left in him. He leaned forward, pushing his body against the bike, and gave it everything he had. As they reached the final curve before the finish line, the world seemed to slow down. The roar of the engines, the sound of his heartbeat in his ears, and the hum of the crowd, all of it faded into the background as Keanu shot forward. With one last push, he edged ahead of Max, crossing the finish line just inches before him. The crowd erupted into cheers, the roar of excitement shaking the ground beneath them. Keanu had done it. He was out of breath, his leg throbbing, but the sense of triumph filled him like a warm rush. He had won. Not just the race, but the battle. Max rolled to a stop behind him, his face a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. The other bikers slowed their engines, and the crowd surged forward, chanting Keanu's name. "Didn't think—" "You had it in you," Max said, wiping sweat from his brow. He held out a hand, his usual cocky grin replaced by something more sincere. "You earned that, Reeves." Keanu looked at the hand, then at the crowd, his heart still racing. With a nod, he shook Max's hand. The hat was still on his head, but what had really changed was the way he saw himself, and the way the world saw him now. "All right," Keanu said, catching his breath. "That's enough racing for today. But let's talk about that deciding part, shall we?" The crowd laughed, and even Max cracked a smile. As the noise of the crowd began to settle, Keanu realized something. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It was about facing his own limits, overcoming them, and finding strength in unexpected places. He had earned more than just a win. He had earned respect, and that, in the end, was far more valuable than a hat. The crowd was still buzzing with excitement, their cheers echoing off the surrounding buildings. Keanu stood, his bike at rest beside him, his body still pulsing with the aftershock of the race. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the cool night air. The pain in his leg had subsided for the moment, but there was something else bubbling inside him now. Adrenaline, yes, but also a sense of something deeper. He had won the race, sure, but the challenge wasn't over. Max, still catching his breath from the race, took a step back, his eyes flicking from Keanu to the bikers behind him. The smugness had faded from his face, replaced by a mixture of frustration and reluctant respect. But even as he acknowledged Keanu's victory, something about the way he stood, like he was holding back, made Keanu uneasy. "You may have won the race, but don't think this is over," Max said, his voice low and controlled. The crowd had begun to thin out, but there were still enough people milling around to keep the atmosphere tense. Keanu could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise, a sense of danger creeping in. He'd played the game, but now, it seemed, Max wanted more. Keanu furrowed his brow. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice steady but his instincts on high alert. "You said it was over if I won." Max gave a slow, deliberate smile. It wasn't a friendly smile, but the kind of smile that made Keanu's stomach tighten. "Yeah, well, the thing is, we don't always play by the rules." Before Keanu could respond, a few of Max's crew stepped forward, their eyes hard and unblinking. They were silent, just standing there, waiting. Keanu's mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. Had Max set him up from the start? "We might have lost the race, but that doesn't mean we walk away empty-handed," Max continued, his tone mocking now. "The thing is, Reeves, you've got something we want. And we're not just talking about a hat. We've got some unfinished business from before this race even started. And it's time for you to face the music. Keanu took a step back, trying to gauge the situation. Something was off, and it wasn't just the way Max was acting. There was a deeper tension here, one that wasn't about racing anymore. It was about power, control, and something far darker. A couple of Max's guys started moving toward Keanu's bike, not in a friendly manner. They were circling him now, inching closer, as if they were waiting for a reason to strike. Keanu's heart rate picked up again, but this time it wasn't from the thrill of the race. It was from the threat that had just materialized out of nowhere. "All right," Keanu said, his voice calm but carrying an edge now. "What exactly do you want?" Max's grin widened. "You see, there's a lot of money riding on that hat of yours. You've got a reputation, Reeves. People pay for that kind of thing. And we've got a little business deal we need to settle. So here's what's going to happen. You hand over the hat, and we walk away. You keep the hat, and we'll have a different conversation." Keanu's pulse raced again, but this time he felt something else, a cold realization. It wasn't about the hat. It wasn't about a stupid race. Max and his crew weren't after a piece of clothing. They were after something bigger, something dangerous. And Keanu had just walked into a trap that he wasn't sure he could get out of. The sound of approaching sirens suddenly pierced the night air, cutting through the tension like a knife. Max's grin faltered for just a second, his eyes narrowing. As he turned toward the street, the sound was getting louder, and Keanu's eyes flicked toward the corner where the flashing lights were coming from. Police? News vans? His mind raced, but in that split second he realized something crucial. The bikers weren't afraid of the cops, they were counting on something else. "You think the cops will save you?" Max scoffed, turning back to Keanu with a sneer. "This isn't a game, Reeves. It's bigger than you think." The sirens grew louder, and Keanu could feel the shift in the air. The bikers weren't running. They were waiting for something. Waiting for him to make a move, to show weakness, to reveal fear. Keanu's eyes narrowed, his mind working quickly. He had to stay calm, stay sharp. There was more going on here than he had anticipated, and if he wasn't careful, he'd be caught in the middle of something that could ruin him. The last few bikers came forward, pushing Keanu toward his bike. But instead of reaching for the helmet or the handlebars, he did something that surprised even himself. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but the cameras that had been documenting the event earlier were still around. He quickly opened the camera app, taking a quick picture of Max and the crew. Something, anything, that could serve as evidence of what was happening. Max, noticing the move, stopped in his tracks. "You think you can just call for help?" he growled, taking a step forward. "You think that's going to change anything?" Keanu didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on Max, the camera now pointing right at the bikers. "You don't want to find out what happens next," he said, his voice sharp, the edge of authority cutting through the tension. Max hesitated, his gaze flicking between Keanu and the phone in his hand. He was calculating something, weighing his options. The seconds felt like minutes, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, something clicked. A loud crash echoed through the street as one of the bikes, Keanu's, exploded into flames, sending debris flying into the night. The roar of the fire filled the air, drowning out the noise of the crowd and the distant sirens. Keanu's heart skipped a beat, his eyes flying to the wreckage. The bikers scattered, but it was clear. Someone had made a move. And this wasn't just a warning anymore. Max and his crew exchanged looks, and for the first time they looked uncertain. Keanu's phone buzzed in his hand, an incoming message from Sarah, who had been keeping an eye on things from the sidelines. "Get out of there now, they've got backup coming." But it was already too late. The race had been just the beginning. Now Keanu was on a much darker journey, and this time there would be no simple victory. The flames from the wrecked bike flickered in the background, casting a dancing glow on Keanu's face as his heart pounded in his chest. The sirens grew louder, closer now, but the bikers, Max included, were no longer paying attention to the approaching authorities. Their focus had shifted. Their eyes were on Keanu, but not with the same mocking confidence they'd had before. This time there was something darker in their gaze. Keanu's phone buzzed again, but he didn't look down. He was still processing the explosion, the chaos that had erupted around him. Someone had deliberately targeted his bike. No one from Max's crew had the kind of weapons or skills to pull off something like that. Except one person. "Max," Keanu said, his voice even, but with an edge. "You know who did this, don't you?" Max's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. He knew exactly what Keanu was implying. His crew was still shifting around nervously, their previous bravado now replaced by uncertainty. The biker who had exploded Keanu's ride wasn't one of Max's. That much was clear. Someone had played a much deeper hand in this, and Max wasn't in control anymore. Keanu's mind raced. His thoughts spun back to the months before, back when the races had started to feel more like something personal, something bigger than just street rivalry. Back when he had gotten involved with Max's crew in the first place, thinking it was just a game. But now, everything felt darker. This wasn't about a stolen hat or proving who was better at riding. This was about something else. The flames flickered again, casting a jagged orange light across Max's face. He looked for a moment like he might say something, then thought better of it. "Let's go," Max finally spat, his voice tinged with frustration. "You've won your race, you've had your moment, but the game's far from over, Reeves. You'll be sorry you crossed us." But just as Max turned to leave, a voice rang out from the shadows, cold and sharp. "Not so fast, Max." The bikers froze. Keanu turned to see a tall figure emerging from the darkness. It was a man, his face mostly obscured by a black helmet and a long dark trench coat. His body language was different from the others, calm, controlled, and it was that calm that made everything feel wrong. Max tensed, recognizing the figure. Immediately. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice shaky. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something that made Keanu's heart skip. It was a small silver badge, a police badge. But not just any badge. The badge gleamed with authority, the kind that told you this wasn't an ordinary officer. This man wasn't just here to observe, he was here to control. "Don't act like you're in charge anymore, Max," the man said, his voice like ice. "You're out of your depth, all of you are." Max's face turned pale, his jaw clenched, and for a moment Keanu could almost see the last remnants of his arrogance crack. Whatever this man was, he had Max on edge. "What's this about?" Max demanded. "How you can't just—" "I'm not here for your nonsense," the man interrupted, his tone lethal. He turned to Keanu, who stood frozen, unsure whether to move forward or stay back. "And you? Keanu Reeves, right? You think you're out? Of your element? You think this is about some silly street race?" Keanu swallowed hard. His instincts told him to stay calm, but everything about this situation screamed danger. "What do you want?" Keanu asked, his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. The man stepped forward, and Keanu could now make out the edges of his face, partially illuminated by the nearby flames. His eyes were cold, calculating, with none of the warmth that Keanu had come to expect from a moment like this. There was no humor, no light-heartedness. This wasn't just a street challenge, it was something bigger. "You're in the middle of something you don't understand," the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've been playing in a league much larger than what you've imagined, and now you've stirred the wrong pot." Max, still standing beside the group of bikers, finally spoke up, his voice shaking. "We don't know anything about this. We were just here for the race, just for fun. What are you talking about?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "I think you're just some harmless street racers," he scoffed. "You have no idea what's really been going on here, the races, the stakes. You've been pawns in a game much larger than you could have imagined. But you, Reeves, you've crossed the line. Now there are consequences." Keanu felt a wave of realization wash over him. His mind scrambled to connect the dots, the cryptic messages, the strange tension he'd been feeling in the past few days, the fact that the race had always seemed just a little too big, too dangerous. It wasn't just about a competition anymore. There was something darker, more hidden beneath the surface. The man shifted slightly, his eyes locking onto Keanu's. "Max was never the one in charge, and now you're going to learn exactly who is." Before Keanu could react, the man threw a quick glance at Max's crew. One by one, the bikers backed off, clearly intimidated by the newcomer's presence. Max stood there, jaw clenched, clearly trying to figure out his next move. But the air had shifted. The game had changed. Keanu's chest tightened as the weight of the situation settled in. His victory in the race felt hollow now. Winning didn't matter in the face of whatever dark secret was about to unfold before him. "Who are you?" Keanu asked, his voice low but cutting through the tension. The man took a step forward, his expression hard. "You're about to find out. Everything you thought you knew about this world is about to shatter." The sirens were close now, too close. The man's lips curled again, this time into something sinister. "Get in the car, we're taking this to the next level." Keanu felt the full weight of the situation hit him. He wasn't just up against Max and his crew anymore. This was something far more dangerous. He had unknowingly crossed into a world of high stakes, where the rules of the game were deadly serious. And the finish line? It wasn't just a race anymore. It was a life-or-death challenge. As the black car pulled up, its windows tinted dark, Keanu didn't hesitate. He took one last look at the wreckage of his bike, now a burning heap of metal and plastic, and then followed the man to the car. It was time to face whatever this game truly was. The doors slammed shut behind him, and Keanu's world was about to change forever. The car's interior was sleek, almost sterile in its design. It had an unsettling, cold aura to it. Keanu sat in the back, his body tense, his mind racing as the car sped through the city. The man who had led him into the car was now seated across from him, his dark eyes fixed on Keanu with an unsettling intensity. The sound of the engine hummed steadily, punctuating the silence between them. Keanu's mind struggled to keep up. His stomach churned from the adrenaline, but also from the overwhelming feeling of being out of control. How had he gotten here? 1 minute he was racing for the thrill of the challenge, and now he was trapped in a world of danger and deception. Nothing about this situation felt like the street racing he knew. The man broke the silence, his voice calm and measured. "You're asking all the wrong questions, Reeves." Keanu's jaw tightened, his body bracing for whatever came next. "I want answers. What's really going on? Who are you? And what do you want from me?" The man's lips curled into a small, almost sympathetic smile. "You've been playing with fire, and now you're starting to realize you're not even on the edge of the inferno yet." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Keanu's. "You've been part of something much bigger than you. And you, the races, the bets, the stakes, it's all part of a larger network, one that has far-reaching consequences." Keanu swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the words. His mind flashed back to the races, the tension he had felt when the stakes began to rise higher than usual, when Max's crew had acted as if they were part of a larger game. But he had always assumed it was just the nature of street racing. There was always someone higher up, someone pulling the strings. "I don't get it," Keanu muttered. "You're telling me that this is all some kind of conspiracy, a network of underground races. How deep does this go?" The man leaned back, the dark corners of his eyes catching the dim light as he spoke. "Deep enough that it could change everything. You've been unknowingly involved in a betting ring that spans continents, but you're not just anyone, Reeves. You're a player in a much bigger game than you realized. The moment you took that challenge, when you put your name on the line, you entered a world of much higher stakes." Keanu's head spun. The notion of underground races and international betting had always been the stuff of movies, not something he ever thought he would be mixed up in. But now, with the pieces falling into place, he felt the weight of the situation press down on him. "So, what's this about the hat?" Keanu asked, finally connecting the dots. "You said it's worth something. Is it part of this network you're talking about?" The man's smile faltered for a second before he regained composure. "The hat isn't important, not in the way you think. It's a symbol, a marker. It represents the stakes, the price of entry into this world. The reason you were targeted wasn't because of some small bet, but because you've become an asset, and now you're being tested." Keanu's mind reeled as the man's words settled in. The races had been more than just a challenge. They had been a test, a gateway into something far more dangerous. The real question now was why he had been chosen. Why him? And what was this game he had stumbled into? Tested for what? Keanu demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced out the window, his eyes calculating. There's more to you than meets the eye, Keanu. You've always been good at playing the role of the outsider, the lone wolf. But the truth is, you're far more connected than you realize. The very reason you're here is because you've been on our radar for a long time. We've watched you, your decisions, your ability to navigate situations, and most importantly, your willingness to step up when the stakes are high. People like you, people with that kind of grit, well, they don't come along often. Keanu stared at him, his mind trying to piece together the cryptic message. He had always been the guy who took chances, who lived for the moment. But this was something else entirely. This was a game he hadn't signed up for. But now, there was no turning back. I don't care about any of this, Keanu said through gritted teeth. I just want out. I didn't ask for this. None of this was part of the plan. The man's expression shifted, becoming more serious. You think you can walk away? You think anyone can walk away from this once they've crossed the line? He shook his head slowly. You're already in it, Reeves. There's no getting out unless you can outplay us, unless you can prove you're more than just a player. You'll need to make some choices, and fast. Keanu felt the pressure mounting. He had always been good at navigating tight situations, but this was unlike anything he'd ever faced. It wasn't about speed or skill. It wasn't about outsmarting the competition in a race. This was a different kind of game, one where the stakes were his very life. The car came to a stop and the man's eyes shifted to Keanu once more. You'll have to decide soon, whether you become part of this world or whether you're just another casualty. The choice is yours, but be warned. Every move you make will have consequences. The door opened and the man stepped out, his shadow stretching long in the dim light. Come on, he said, motioning for Keanu to follow. The real game starts now. Keanu hesitated for a moment, his mind still grappling with the gravity of the situation. He had won a race, sure, but this wasn't about speed anymore. It was about survival. The weight of what was coming next settled heavily on his shoulders as he stepped out of the car and followed the man into the unknown. As Keanu walked into the unknown, he realized that this wasn't just a test of speed or strength. This was a test of everything he had ever believed in. It was a game where the rules changed with every move, and the consequences were always lethal. And somewhere deep inside, Keanu understood that there was no way to win this game without losing a piece of himself. The chill of the night air brushed against Keanu's skin as he stepped out of the car. He glanced around, trying to adjust his eyes to the dimly lit surroundings. They had pulled up to a large, imposing warehouse that seemed to stretch on endlessly in the dark. A thick fog rolled in from the nearby river, adding an eerie atmosphere to the scene. The man, still no name, just cold and calculated, led the way, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Keanu's mind was racing, each thought a desperate attempt to find a way out, but the nagging truth remained. He was trapped. There was no way back to his old life. He had crossed too many lines, made too many decisions. The door to the warehouse creaked open, revealing a cavernous interior filled with shadows and a faint hum of machinery. As Keanu stepped inside, the tension in the air was palpable. He wasn't alone. The man turned toward Keanu, his face unreadable. This is where the final game begins. You won't have a choice, you'll just have to play. The only question is, will you be a pawn or a king? Keanu's stomach churned. He had already played their game, taken the bait, and now he was in too deep to back out. His every instinct screamed for him to run, but his feet betrayed him, following the man into the depths of the warehouse. Suddenly, the sound of voices reached his ears, low murmurs, the distinct clink of metal. The room ahead was dimly lit, with figures gathered around a large table. As Keanu's eyes adjusted, he could see a mix of faces, some familiar, others completely unknown. A diverse crew from street racers to individuals who seemed far removed from the world Keanu once knew. Max stood at the far end of the table, his face darkened with anxiety. His usual bravado had evaporated, replaced by a clear sense of tension. As Keanu stepped into the light, Max's eyes flickered to him, and for the first time there was a hint of fear in them. You, Max said, his voice hoarse. I didn't think you'd make it this far. Keanu didn't respond, instead scanning the room. His eyes locked on the man at the center of the table, who had remained silent up to this point. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face impeccably calm. This was the one who had orchestrated everything, the one pulling the strings. He stood and addressed the room, his voice low but commanding. Keanu Reeves, welcome to the game. He let the words hang in the air, as if weighing their significance. This is the final stage. You've proven your worth by making it here, but that doesn't mean you're ready for what's next. Keanu's heart pounded. This man was the heart of the operation, the mastermind who had turned the simple thrill of street racing into a deadly game. The man's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the room, then locked eyes with Keanu. You've been chosen for a reason, not because you're the fastest or the strongest, but because you're different. You don't play by the rules, and that makes you dangerous. Keanu swallowed. Dangerous, was that it? The whole time he thought it was about proving himself on the road. But this was something else entirely. The man gestured toward the table, where a series of small devices were scattered in front of several people. This is where the game truly begins. Each of you has a choice: continue playing or walk away. But walking away isn't an option. You'll be tied to this world forever. Keanu's mind raced. The weight of his choices settled on him, heavier than any bike he'd ever ridden, more suffocating than the speed of any race. He looked at the faces around the table, seeing fear and determination in equal measure. These people, like him, were pawns, and yet the room was charged with an energy that made it feel like he was one step away from being consumed. You want me to play? Keanu asked, his voice firm. What if I refuse? The man's expression didn't change, but there was a chilling silence in his eyes. You'll find out soon enough, he replied softly. But understand this, Keanu. Refusal is no longer an option. You're already too far in. The game is bigger than you, and the consequences, well, they're irreversible. Keanu's blood ran cold. The truth was sinking in now. There was no winning this game. Not if he kept playing by their rules. He could walk away, but there was no guarantee he'd survive. They'd find him, track him down, make him regret ever stepping into their world. This wasn't just about a race anymore. It was about survival, about power. And power, Keanu realized, was something that was always held by the people in control, the ones sitting at the table, making the rules. But then, something shifted in Keanu. A quiet defiance stirred inside him. He wasn't going to be just another pawn in their game. He wasn't going to let them decide his fate. There had to be another way, another path forward. Suddenly, he stood up. I'm done with this. I'm done with being your puppet, Keanu said, his voice steady. You want to play your game? Fine. But it's going to be on my terms from here on out. The room fell silent. The man at the table raised an eyebrow, amused. You think you can change the rules? You think you can just walk away from all of this? Let me remind you, Reeves, you've been in this game from the moment you put on that damn hat. And now you're part of it. Keanu's eyes blazed with determination. No one controls me. Not anymore. The tension in the room grew thick, but Keanu didn't back down. He wasn't playing by their rules anymore. If this was going to be his last game, he would control the final move. Max, still seated at the table, stared at him, and for the first time since Keanu had met him, the familiar arrogance was gone. There was a fleeting moment of something like respect in his eyes. You're crazy, Max muttered under his breath, but Keanu knew what was really being said. It wasn't a challenge. It was an acknowledgement. The man at the table stood, his calm demeanor slipping just for a moment as a dangerous edge entered his voice. You think you can just walk away? You're wrong. Keanu met his gaze unflinching. I guess we'll find out. In that moment, Keanu realized something he hadn't fully understood before. The game was never about winning. It was about power. And the only way to truly win was to take it back. To fight not just for survival, but for control. As the man glared at him, Keanu knew there would be no easy way out. The stakes had never been higher. But one thing was certain. If this was the final game, Keanu was ready to play. on his terms. Damn. Silence in the warehouse was deafening. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath as Keanu stood tall, facing the man who had orchestrated this twisted game. The air around them felt thick with anticipation, the tension like a taut wire, ready to snap. The other players at the table remained eerily still, their eyes flickering between Keanu and the man at the head of the table, who had just risen from his seat, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table as if pondering his next move. Keanu's mind was laser-focused. He knew the game was rigged, and he knew he wasn't going to win if he followed their rules. This was no longer about racing bikes or playing the fast game. It was about taking back control. About making sure they knew they couldn't just pull the strings on him. His heart pounded, but his resolve was unwavering. This was his moment. "I told you," Keanu said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "I'm done being a pawn in your game. I'm not here to play by your rules anymore." The man across from him smiled thinly, a sharp glint in his eyes. "You think you have any say in this? You're just a tool, a pawn, Keanu. You've always been. But you're right about one thing. This is the final game. The stakes are higher than you know, and if you think you can leave, well, that's where you're wrong." Keanu stood his ground. "I didn't come here for this. I didn't ask for your underground world of bets and races. But now, I'm going to make sure you regret it." For a second, the man seemed unfazed, but Keanu could see the faintest flicker of doubt in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, Keanu's boldness was starting to crack the illusion of control this man had built around himself. His fingers clenched into fists, and Keanu could see the tension building in his body as he weighed his options. Max, who had been silent until now, suddenly stood up from his seat. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by something darker, more serious. He slowly walked toward Keanu, stopping just a few feet away. "I didn't think you had it in you," Max said quietly. "But you're right. You're not the same guy who walked into that first race. You've changed." Keanu glanced at him, his expression hardening. "Yeah, well, sometimes change is the only way to survive, and I'm not here for your games. Anymore." Max met his gaze for a long moment, then looked toward the man at the table. Without a word, he took a step back, as if he understood that this was no longer his battle. Keanu wasn't the same player he had been before. He had evolved, grown stronger, and more importantly, he had learned the true nature of the game. The man at the table sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "You think you can walk out of here? Fine. But know this, you're not the only one with power. We can make your life a living hell, Keanu. You think you're untouchable? Think again." Keanu's lips curled into a small smile. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had nothing left to lose. "Maybe I don't have your kind of power, but I know people, and I know how to fight." The man stared at him, calculating. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about power, this is about survival. And survival is a game you're about to lose." Keanu's eyes never left his. "I've survived worse, and I'm not losing this one." The room felt smaller, now the air thick with the impending chaos that could break loose at any second. The other players at the table were silent, watching the confrontation unfold with a mix of curiosity and unease. But Keanu wasn't concerned with them. This moment was between him and the man at the table. This was the reckoning. The man's eyes narrowed, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You're not as smart as you think you are, Reeves, but go ahead. Keep thinking you're in control. It won't last long." Keanu didn't flinch. "You're right, it won't last long, but it'll be enough to change everything." There was a shift in the room, a subtle movement of energy. The tension had reached its peak, and now it felt like something was about to break. Keanu knew that every move he made from here on out would determine whether or not he would walk away alive, whether or not he would emerge victorious. But he also knew one thing. He wasn't going down without a fight. Max looked between Keanu and the man at the table, his eyes flashing with uncertainty. This wasn't the way things were supposed to go. He had been part of this world long enough to know that control was the key to everything, and Keanu was threatening that control. If Keanu succeeded, It would send ripples through the entire network, shaking the very foundation of their power. The man at the table stood up, his hands pressed flat against the table. You want to play it this way? Fine. But know this. When you're up against us, you're not just facing the odds. You're facing a system that's been built over years. You can't take it down with a single move. Keanu didn't back down. He stepped closer, his voice steady. No system is invincible, and you're about to learn that the hard way. Suddenly the door to the warehouse slammed open, and in walked several armed guards, their heavy boots echoing across the concrete floor. Keanu's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't flinch. He had expected this. It was part of the game. But then, just as quickly as they appeared, the guards froze. A second group of figures entered the room, and Keanu's heart skipped again, but for an entirely different reason. It was his crew. Max's jaw clenched in frustration. The tables were turning. Keanu had anticipated this move. His crew wasn't just there to support him. They were there to send a message. This wasn't just Keanu's fight anymore. It was a stand against everything this game stood for. The man at the table scowled, his eyes flashing with fury. You think you've won, don't you? You think this is over? Keanu nodded slowly. No, but it's the beginning of the end for you. The moment stretched on as both sides braced for the inevitable clash. The fate of the game, the battle for control, was about to play out in the most unpredictable way, and Keanu? He was ready for it, ready to take on whatever came next, because this was the fight that mattered, the one that would define his future. The room seemed to pulse with the weight of the moment, as if the entire world outside the warehouse had come to a standstill. Keanu stood with his crew, his body tense but his mind clear, staring down the man who had orchestrated it all, the mastermind who had built this deadly, high-stakes world. His crew was spread out, each member looking as determined as he felt, but the energy in the air was thick with uncertainty. The guards stood frozen, unsure of who to follow. Keanu's crew was solid, but the tension was undeniable. The man at the head of the table, whose calm demeanor had been shattered, turned sharply to face the guards who had entered with him. "Get them!" he barked, his voice cold and commanding. But there was hesitation now, uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't the one with the power anymore. Keanu had taken it. The man's eyes flashed to Keanu, his expression hardening. "You think this is your victory?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "You're in over your head, Reeves. You don't even know who you're up against." Keanu felt the full weight of his words settle on him. The truth was, he didn't know the full extent of what he was dealing with. But he had come this far. He couldn't stop now. He wasn't about to let this world control him any longer. "This is not about victory," Keanu replied, his voice steady. "This is about taking back what you stole from me, what you stole from all of us." The man's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You think you can just walk away from this? From us? You think we won't find a way to make you regret this?" Keanu didn't flinch. "I'm not walking away. I'm finishing it. And as for you," he said, turning to face the guards, "if you've got any sense left, you'll walk away too, or you'll end up just like him." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, some of them lowering their weapons, others shifting, uncomfortably. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and it wasn't in the favor of the man at the table. The man narrowed his eyes. "You can't control this, Reeves. You can't just rip it down because you're tired of the game. You want to throw away your chance at power? Fine. But know this, there's always someone else waiting to take your place." Keanu stepped forward, his crew at his back. He was done with the threats, done with being afraid. He had seen the true face of the system, the cruelty, the manipulation, the exploitation, and he wasn't about to let it win. "Then let them try," Keanu said, his voice hard as steel. "But I'll be damned if I let anyone take control again." The room went quiet. No one moved. Keanu's crew was in position, ready for whatever came next. But the standoff felt different now. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was about more than survival. It was about freedom. Freedom from the system, from the manipulation, from the never-ending cycle that had held everyone prisoner. The man at the table stood frozen, his eyes scanning the room, weighing his options. He was the one with the power, or at least he had been. But Keanu had shown him something important. Power wasn't about control, it was about choice. Keanu had taken the choice back, and with that, he had taken the power. The man's gaze flickered, and for the first time Keanu saw a crack in his confidence. This wasn't the end the man had planned, not by a long shot. And he knew, deep down, that Keanu had already won. Without a word, the man turned away, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "So you think this changes anything? You think you've won?" he muttered, almost to himself. Keanu held his ground. "I've already won," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the finality. "I've taken back control. And that's enough." The room remained still, the guards standing motionless, unsure of what to do. Keanu's crew moved in, silently, but with a sense of purpose. The system had crumbled in front of them, and now there was nothing left to fight for but the future. Max stepped forward, his eyes meeting Keanu's. There was no more arrogance in his expression, only understanding. "So you did it," Max said, his voice thick with respect. "You changed the game, you really did." Keanu nodded, the weight of the battle lifting from his shoulders. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel like a winner. He just felt free. The man at the table turned back, his eyes no longer filled with the same contempt. "You're right," he said, his voice weary. "It's over. But this world will keep going, with or without you." Keanu's gaze softened, but his resolve remained firm. "Maybe, but it won't be the same. Not anymore." With that, the man left, his guards following suit, retreating into the shadows from which they had come. The sound of their footsteps, fading into the night, was the last piece of the puzzle falling into place. Keanu looked around the room. The warehouse, once a symbol of control and fear, now felt empty. His crew, their faces illuminated by the soft light filtering in from the broken windows, stood tall. They were no longer part of the game. They were free. Max placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they'd been through. "You're not the same guy you were when you started," Max said, his voice softer now. "You've grown. And so have the rest of us." Keanu nodded, feeling the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. "Maybe it's not about the race. Maybe it's about the people you choose to fight for." The warehouse, once a battlefield, was now just a place in the past. Keanu and his crew had left their mark. The game had ended, not with a victory in the traditional sense, but with the ultimate act of defiance. They had taken back their freedom, and in doing so had taken control of their own futures. Keanu looked out toward the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while he felt like he was ready to face it, because the real victory wasn't in beating the system. It was in the choice to walk away from it, stronger, wiser, and finally free.